Everyone thought my grandson adored me. That was the picture they saw. The truth showed up one afternoon at his school, sharp, careless, and spoken in words a child shouldn't know how to use. The other kids laughed when he said them. I stood there smiling, because smiling was something I had learned to do when something inside me quietly cracked. I didn't realize it in that moment, but those words didn't start with him. They started at home. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 71 years old, a retired library aide, and the kind of woman people describe as easygoing. I've heard low maintenance, too, usually said like it's a compliment. My bones felt older than I was long before I admitted it out loud. I raised my son, Andrew, mostly on my own after his father passed. I worked double shifts, packed lunches at midnight, and learned how to make reassurance sound stronger than fear. Andrew grew into a decent man. A gentle one. The kind who believes calm voices mean honest intentions. When he married Lauren, I truly thought I was gaining a daughter. She hugged me tightly in public, called me Mom with a warm smile, posted photos online with captions about gratitude and family. At home, the tone shifted. Not loudly. Just enough. Lauren corrected how I folded towels, how I spoke to Ethan, how long I stood at the stove. She never raised her voice. She smiled while she did it, like she was helping me. Andrew came home tired, shoulders slumped, mind already elsewhere. When he asked if everything was okay, it felt more like a habit than a question. I told myself it was temporary. Families adjust. Older women step back. So I let it slide. Ethan was 7 when he started saying things that didn't sit right with me. Grandma, you're slow. Grandma, Mom says you mess things up. The first time, he laughed, unsure if it was a joke. I corrected him gently. The second time, he didn't look at me at all. He glanced toward the hallway first, checking for permission he didn't know he was asking for. Lauren didn't scold him. She shrugged and said, "He's just being honest," then added, "Kids notice more than we think." I noticed more too. I noticed how respect disappeared when Andrew wasn't in the room. How Lauren answered questions for me at doctor appointments, how she talked about my memory while I was sitting right there. I noticed how Ethan mirrored her tone, polite when others watched, dismissive when they didn't. The school day came without warning. Andrew asked me to pick Ethan up early. The playground smelled like hot asphalt and sunscreen. Children lined up, backpacks dragging, voices sharp and careless. Ethan saw me and sighed. Loud enough for his friends to hear, he said, "Why is she here?" "She's embarrassing." One boy laughed. Another repeated it. Then Ethan added, without hesitation, "My mom says she's useless anyway." The word landed heavy. Useless. My chest tightened, just slightly. My hand gripped my purse strap a little harder. A teacher's whistle shrieked in the distance, too bright for the moment. Children don't invent words like that. They carry them. I didn't cry. I didn't scold him. I signed him out and held his hand like I always did. He pulled away. In the car, I asked where he heard it. He stared out the window and said, "Mom says it when you're not around." He said it the way kids talk about rules, without emotion, without ownership. Children don't understand betrayal. They just pass it along. That night, Lauren laughed over dinner, telling Andrew a story from work. Andrew smiled, nodded, asked a follow-up question. Ethan asked for dessert. No one asked about school. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space where conversation should have been. That was when something finally settled in me. My silence wasn't keeping the peace anymore. It was protecting a pattern. I didn't confront Lauren. I didn't corner Andrew. I stayed exactly where I was. But I started paying attention differently. I wrote things down in an old notebook, dates, phrases, how conversations changed when Andrew entered the room. I noticed how Lauren framed control as concern. He needs structure. She forgets things. Andrew trusted the calmest explanation, even when it skipped the truth. A week later, Ethan's teacher asked for a meeting. Lauren read the note first and frowned. "Probably nothing," she said, folding it neatly. That evening, Andrew mentioned it. Not accusing, just uncertain. Lauren answered before I could. He nodded, but something flickered across his face, a pause, brief but real. At the meeting, the teacher spoke carefully. She mentioned language. Ethan was using phrases that sounded learned, not imagined. Lauren brushed it off, blaming television. The teacher asked who spent afternoons with him. "I do," I said. Lauren corrected me. Margaret mostly rests. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The teacher nodded slowly, like she was filing something away. That night, Andrew asked again if everything was okay. His voice lingered this time, waiting. Lauren answered first. I smiled and said yes. Inside, something had shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning revenge. I was awake. And once you're awake, you don't rush. You observe. You let people keep being who they already are. Because the truth doesn't arrive loudly. It gathers quietly. And that was the week I realized. Things were already beginning to change. The week after that meeting, nothing looked different from the outside. The house still smelled like brewed coffee in the mornings. The front lawn was trimmed on schedule. Lauren still greeted neighbors with that soft smile people trusted without thinking twice. From the curb, we looked like a family that had it together. That illusion mattered to her. It always had. Inside, though, the rules had shifted again. Quietly. Almost politely. She started reminding me about things I had done my whole life without reminders. When to take my pills. How much salt was reasonable now. Which chair was better for my back, even when the other one was closer to the window I liked. None of it sounded cruel. That was the point. This wasn't cruelty in the loud sense. It was conditioning. She'd slide my plate a little farther away at dinner, then apologize sweetly when I reached for it. Oh, sorry, Margaret, I thought you were done. Sometimes she'd say it twice in one meal. Andrew barely noticed. He was tired, distracted, always half-present. He trusted her efficiency. I could see it in the way he nodded instead of looking up. Ethan watched more closely. Children always do. One night, while he was doing homework at the table, I reached for a cookie I had baked that afternoon. Before Lauren said a word, Ethan cleared his throat and said, "Grandma, Mom says sugar messes with your meds." His voice wasn't rude. It was practiced. That hurt more than if he'd yelled. Lauren didn't correct him. She just kept washing dishes, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, like the lesson had landed exactly where she wanted it. She began speaking for me when people asked questions. At the pharmacy, she answered before I could. At church, she explained why I sat near the aisle now. Just easier for her, she'd say, hand on my arm, fingers light but firm. People smiled. They always do when a younger woman performs care correctly. I started noticing patterns instead of moments. How often my preferences were reframed as limitations. How decisions were presented as accommodations. How Andrew's silence filled the space where my voice used to be. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed. Because I was watching. The nurse noticed before anyone else. She was new, young, with kind eyes and a clipboard she kept tucked close to her chest. She asked the usual questions, then paused. "Do you feel hurt here?" It wasn't accusatory. It was almost casual. Lauren glanced at her phone. Andrew shifted his weight. I looked at the wall. At the small crack near the corner I'd memorized months ago. "Not always," I said. "Just that." The nurse nodded, made a note, and met my eyes for half a second longer than necessary. That look stayed with me. After that appointment, Lauren became overly attentive. Too attentive. She offered tea I hadn't asked for. Asked twice if I was comfortable. Her voice was syrupy, stretched thin. It didn't sound like kindness. It sounded like control trying to reassert itself. Andrew noticed the change, even if he didn't name it. He watched her once when she thought no one was looking. Just a beat. Not enough to argue, but enough to register. I didn't push. I didn't explain. I adjusted instead. I stopped reacting. I took my pills when I chose, not when reminded. I ate slowly, deliberately. I let silences sit without filling them. Ethan looked confused at first, then thoughtful. Lauren smiled harder. The house felt tighter, like something being wounded instead of broken. I wasn't lying to anyone. I was choosing timing. Patterns don't break when you fight them. They break when you stop participating. They kept saying I looked better. That was the strange part. Neighbors stopped me near the mailbox at the grocery store, even outside the church parking lot, telling me I seemed lighter, brighter, like something had finally eased. Lauren stood beside me during those moments, nodding, smiling that practiced smile, the one that said she was the reason. Inside the house, though, the air felt heavier than before, like every room was holding its breath. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the trick. Control doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in, rearranges itself, and waits for you to stop noticing. Lauren began reorganizing things that didn't need reorganizing. My kitchen drawer. The hallway closet. The small wooden box where I kept letters from Andrew's father, folded the same way for years. She never threw anything away outright. She just moved it somewhere harder to reach, then later claimed she couldn't remember where it went. When I asked, she laughed softly, like I'd misplaced my own memory. Andrew said I was probably just tired. That word again. Tired. The easiest way to shrink a person without laying a hand on them. I started testing myself quietly, not to challenge her, but to be sure I still knew what was real. I placed my reading glasses on the corner of the nightstand every evening, the same way I always had. 3 nights in a row, they were gone by morning, later reappearing in a different room. Lauren shrugged it off, said I must have set them down somewhere else. I didn't argue. I just noted the time, the place, the way her voice stayed calm while her fingers fidgeted with her sleeve. I stopped asking twice. I learned that questions were allowed only once. Then came money, eased in under the excuse of help. Lauren offered to manage my bills, said it would be one less thing on my plate. Statements stopped coming to my room. Receipts disappeared. When I asked, she'd say, "It's all taken care of, Margaret. You don't need to stress." Andrew trusted her system. He always had. When I mentioned a late notice that had arrived in the mail, he waved it off, told me Lauren handled all that now. His tone wasn't cruel. It was distracted. That was worse. Ethan started asking permission before speaking to me, his eyes flicking to his mother first, checking her mood like a weather report. Once, when he asked me something simple and I answered, Lauren corrected me in front of him, voice calm, words clean. "That's not exactly right, honey." I watched his shoulders shift. I watched him learn who was safe to listen to. Later that night, he avoided my room altogether, sliding past my door like he wasn't sure what version of the house he'd find if he stopped. I told myself children adapt to survive. That didn't make it hurt less. Meals changed too, slowly enough that I almost missed it. Portions smaller. Seasoning lighter. Doctor's orders. Lauren said, even when no doctor was mentioned. If I reached for seconds, she'd glance at Andrew, not at me. He'd hesitate, then say maybe she was right. I began eating earlier, alone, finishing before anyone else came into the kitchen. It wasn't hunger that bothered me. It was the permission being removed, piece by piece. The outside world kept slipping in anyway. Carol from next door brought over banana bread one afternoon and stayed longer than Lauren expected. She asked me questions directly, not over my head, not through someone else. Lauren hovered nearby, wiping an already spotless counter, her smile tight around the edges. Carol noticed. Her eyes moved between us, slow and careful. When she asked if I'd like to join her walking group again, Lauren answered before I could, saying I tired too easily these days. Carol paused, just a second too long, then looked at me and asked again. I said I'd think about it. Lauren didn't speak for the rest of the afternoon. Later that night, Lauren corrected me more than usual. Little things. How much water I drank. When I should rest. Where I left my coat. The rules tightened, just enough to feel. Andrew saw it. I could tell by the way he paused, by the way his mouth opened once and then closed. He wasn't blind anymore. He just wasn't brave yet. I didn't fill the silence for him. I let it sit there, awkward and unresolved. The real crack came quietly through a phone call. A receptionist from the clinic asked why I'd missed my follow-up appointment. I told her no one had mentioned it. There was a pause on the line. Just long enough. She checked the chart again, her voice shifting into something more careful. When I hung up, I didn't confront anyone. I walked to my room and pulled out my calendar. The appointment was written there, in someone else's handwriting. Not mine. I stared at it longer than I should have, then turned the page and kept looking. I asked for copies of my records the next time I went in. Told them I liked to keep things straight. The nurse didn't question it. She just nodded, printed the pages, and handed them over. That was when I learned another appointment was scheduled without my knowledge, a medication review I hadn't agreed to. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to shift control further away from me. Enough to matter. Lauren noticed the changes in me before anyone else did. I started asking questions she wasn't used to answering. Small ones. Neutral ones. What day my next refill was due. Which account my utilities were paid from. Whether my name was still listed first on certain forms. Her tone stayed pleasant, but her eyes followed me now, tracked my movements, lingered a beat too long when I left the room. She began offering help before I asked, standing a little closer than necessary, reminding me of things I hadn't forgotten. Andrew began lingering in rooms instead of disappearing into his phone. He listened more than he spoke. Once, I caught him reading through a stack of mail Lauren had left on the counter, his brow furrowed. When he noticed me watching, he folded it back up and said nothing. That silence felt different. He wasn't avoiding conflict anymore. He was avoiding conclusions. Ethan grew quieter, watching all of us like he was waiting for something to break. He stopped correcting me. He stopped correcting anyone. He learned stillness, the way children do when they sense rules are shifting and they don't know where they'll land. The house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was alert. Floors creaked under careful footsteps. Doors closed more softly. Conversations ended mid-sentence when someone else entered the room. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't plotting revenge or rehearsing speeches. I was simply no longer invisible. And somewhere beyond our walls, systems had started to notice the gaps too. Appointments missed. Questions unanswered. Timelines that didn't quite line up. I didn't rush. I didn't push. I let the clock keep ticking on its own, because once institutions start paying attention, silence doesn't protect anyone. I used to think pressure announced itself with noise, raised voices, slammed doors, some kind of scene you could point to later and say, that's when it started. What came after that clinic call was different. It was quieter than all of it, slow and deliberate, like weather changing without asking permission. The house didn't argue anymore, it adjusted. Even the walls seemed to listen. Lauren moved through each room like she owned the air itself, leaving nothing disturbed, but everything changed. She kept the same pleasant smile she wore in public, the one neighbors trusted and church friends praised, but at home it followed me a second too long, like she was measuring something invisible. My pills were lined up on the counter every morning, already counted, already decided. If I reached for the bottle myself, she'd gently touch my wrist and say, "I've got it, Mom, don't stress," her voice sweet, steady, impossible to argue with without sounding ungrateful. That was the trick. Care, when wrapped just right, can feel like a leash. Andrew didn't see it, or maybe he did and chose the easier story. He was working later, coming home tired, dropping his keys with a sigh that said he didn't have room for complications. When I tried to explain something small, he'd say, "Let's not make this a whole thing," or "Lauren's just trying to help," the way people say when they want peace more than truth. It felt like watching him straighten furniture that had already been cracked, convinced that if it looked normal enough, it would be. Ethan learned faster than either of them. Children always do. He started narrating his obedience like it was part of the house rules. "Mom says Grandma shouldn't eat that," or "Mom says Grandma needs to lie down now," his tone neutral, practiced, almost proud. He wasn't cruel. He was trained. Hearing my own limits repeated back to me in a child's voice landed harder than anything Lauren ever said. I wrote more in my notebook then, not out of fear and not even out of anger, but because patterns were forming and patterns don't lie. Money quietly became the new language of control. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just soft suggestions. Lauren offered to handle a bill for me, then later mentioned how confusing statements could be at your stage of life. She asked Andrew questions about my pension and savings in front of me, framing it like planning, like responsibility. He nodded, half listening, trusting her calm confidence more than my silence. That's when it hit me that silence had taught them something about me that wasn't true. They thought quiet meant pliable. Around that time, Carol stopped me by the mailbox one chilly morning. The air smelled like wet leaves and early frost, and the street was unusually still. She didn't ask how I was. She asked if everything was okay. That's a different question. I said yes, because habit is stubborn, but she didn't rush to fill the space the way people usually do. She just said, "If you ever want company walking to the clinic, I'm home most mornings," and gave a small nod before heading back inside. That night, I wrote her name in the notebook, not as help, just as evidence that the world outside this house still noticed me. The pressure kept building in ways that were easy to deny and impossible to ignore. My bedroom door was closed more often, then gently locked for privacy. My old letters went missing one by one, never thrown away, just relocated, always with an explanation ready. Lauren never contradicted me outright. She corrected my memory. "You already told me that. We talked about this, you agreed, remember?" Gaslighting sounds dramatic until you live inside it. What it really feels like is being edited, line by line, until you start doubting the original draft of yourself. Andrew hovered on the edge of awareness, opening his mouth once or twice, then closing it again, like someone who smells smoke but tells himself it's just dinner burning. The moment that shifted, something irreversible didn't happen at home. It happened under fluorescent lights in a grocery store aisle. The cart rattled, the floor squeaked, ordinary sounds. The cashier asked if I wanted the senior discount, and before I could answer, Lauren laughed lightly and said, "She doesn't remember half the prices anyway." The cashier froze, just for a beat too long, eyes flicking from her to me and back again. That pause told me everything my silence hadn't. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I organized my papers. I made copies. I requested statements. I scheduled my own appointments. I started walking with Carol on clinic mornings, the sound of our shoes on pavement steady, grounding. Lauren noticed the change immediately. Control always does. She tightened her grip without raising her voice, reminding Andrew how stressful things were getting, how worried she was, how maybe it was time to talk to someone about next steps. This time, when Andrew agreed, there was fear in his voice, not comfort. That's when I understood this part of the story wasn't about exposure yet. It was about letting the weight shift. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped asking permission. I smiled less in private and more in public. I let Lauren perform. I let Andrew assume. I let systems keep their notes and pauses. The house stayed alert, every sound measured, every kindness calculated, but beneath it all something else was moving, slow and patient. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing reality. And once reality starts lining itself up, it doesn't need permission to arrive. Everyone still thought things were under control. That was the last illusion to fall. By the time the house settled after everything that had been said and not said, I understood something quietly but clearly. Nothing had exploded, and yet everything had shifted. The rhythm of the days stayed the same, but the weight inside them changed. Conversations carried it. Paper carried it. Silence carried it differently than before. Lauren felt it before anyone admitted it out loud. She softened in public, careful in a way that looked considerate if you didn't know the difference. At home, she talked about planning and efficiency, about making things easier down the road. Long-term care. Streamlining. Always framed as concern. Always said with Andrew within earshot. Andrew listened more now, though he still avoided conflict the way some people avoid mirrors. Ethan noticed before either of them. Children always do. He hesitated before repeating instructions. He stopped correcting me automatically. Sometimes he sat beside me without a reason, scrolling on his phone, just staying close like he was anchoring himself to something steady. I kept doing what I had started. I went to my appointments alone and signed my own forms. I asked the nurse to explain things again if I needed to. I checked my statements line by line, not because I expected drama, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. At the bank, when the clerk glanced at the screen and paused before answering a question Lauren had already handled, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I waited. That pause mattered. Paper trails don't argue. They just sit there. Carol still walked with me most mornings. We talked about the weather, her roses, a show she couldn't stop binge-watching. Ordinary things. Normal conversation has a way of reminding you who you were before everything became strategic. One afternoon, Andrew came home early and found Lauren on the phone, her voice tight but controlled, the sound of someone managing instead of understanding. She hung up quickly and said everything was fine. Andrew didn't challenge her, but later that evening he stayed in the kitchen while I made tea. He asked if I was tired. Then, after a pause, he asked if I was happy. Not if I was okay. Happy. The question landed heavier than any accusation. I didn't dramatize my answer. I told him I felt calmer now that I made my own decisions again. I said I slept better. I didn't list what had been taken from me. I let the space speak for itself. A few days later, the call came. Not urgent. Not dramatic. Just official. A routine review had flagged inconsistencies. Finances authorized without my direct confirmation. Medication adjustments discussed with someone else before they were discussed with me. Consent assumed instead of asked for. Nothing criminal. Nothing explosive. Just details that didn't line up once someone bothered to look at them together. Lauren listened on speaker, smiling too often, nodding like agreement could smooth facts. Andrew asked practical questions. Clarifying questions. The kind he'd never asked before. Ethan sat at the table swinging his legs, watching the adults the way kids do when they sense a shift without understanding it yet. The truth didn't arrive like revenge stories promise. It came like gravity. Slow. Certain. After that call, Lauren's confidence fractured in small ways. She explained things no one had asked about. She interrupted professionals who weren't there to be managed. She corrected Andrew too quickly. Andrew noticed. That was the real change. When the call ended, no one raised their voice. No one cried. Lauren went quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peace, just emptiness. Andrew stayed seated long after, staring at the table like it had finally shown him something he couldn't unsee. Later that night, he knocked on my door. He didn't rehearse. He didn't defend himself. He said he was sorry. Not for everything, but for enough. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't ask for more. I accepted the moment for what it was. The next morning, Ethan hugged me before school. Quick, unprompted, sincere. Lauren stayed respectful after that. Careful with her words. Distant in a way that acknowledged boundaries. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. I moved my things where I liked them. I handled my own mail. I chose my meals without commentary. Small freedoms feel big when they've been rationed. Andrew calls more now and listens longer. Sometimes that's what accountability looks like. I didn't win. I wasn't saved. I reclaimed myself quietly, the way I should have all along. Silence protected them once. This time, it protected me. If you believe elders deserve respect, not quiet erasure, please like and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this get heard. I learned something late, but I learned it fully. I stopped asking permission for my dignity, and I stopped explaining my strength.